It's my pleasure today to welcome Professor Alison Wray, Professor of Language and Communication at Cardiff University. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you.
So, Alison, what is communication?
Well, the first thing we have to recognise is that communication is a two-way process, or a three-way process if there's three people involved. So when we're thinking about difficulties that people living with a dementia might have in communication, we can't only think about what's happening to them. We have to think about what's happening to the entire experience of one person speaking, the other person speaking back, and what happens after that. So yes, of course, we'll start by thinking about the impact of dementia on, let's say, some difficulties with aspects of language and so on. But we have to then think, well, how is the other person going to respond to that? And given the way they respond, what options does that give the person living with the dementia for how they respond after that? So it's a kind of a chain effect, and we have to understand the whole process, the whole dynamics of it. If we just try to address one part of it and think that we can fix it that way, we really can't.
So why do we bother?
Why do we bother to communicate? Well, communication has, I think, got one very, very central purpose. And it's the best way to think about it is this. We all live in our own experiential world. The things that we see, the things we do, the things we like, the places we know, the information we know, the things that we hear, taste, and so on. This is all part of our own personal experiential world. And that world is changing all the time. Minute by minute, it's changing. So at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I don't particularly feel hungry, but come 6 o'clock, I might feel hungry. Well, that was just time passing that did that. Nothing changed other than time passing. But all the time, our world is changing. Somebody walks into the room, it's changed our world. It's suddenly time for my TV program. It wasn't before. Now I want the TV on. I didn't before. And so all the time, we're trying to manipulate our world, change our world in little ways, tweak it, that will make it continually comfortable for us. So that means physically comfortable. For example, if I'm feeling a bit cool, I might put a jumper on. If I'm feeling tired, I decide to go to bed early, whatever it might be. But also cognitively, there might be something that I would like to know that would make me feel a little bit more myself, a little bit more, it would be better for my well-being if I knew that thing. Or I might, emotionally, I want to look after my well-being. I want my world to be comfortable emotionally. So there might be something I want to feel, and so I want to change my world so that I can feel that thing or not feel something. Now, a lot of the time, when our world isn't quite as we wanted at that particular moment, what we're going to do is try and change it for ourselves. So if I'm a bit hot, I might go and open the window. Or if I'm hungry, I'll make myself a sandwich. But there are things that we can't do for ourselves that we want to change in our world, but it's not within our power to change them for ourselves. Silly examples, I'm in the supermarket and I can't quite reach the cereal packet on the top shelf. And so I have to find somebody taller and get them to reach it down for me. But there might be information that I want. I can't get it for myself. I've got to get somebody else to give me that information. Or I feel uncomfortable and I want somebody to do something or say something that will make me feel better. Now, as soon as we are trying to get other people to modify our world to make us feel a little bit more comfortable, we've got to find a way to get them to do that. How are we going to do that? Through communication, and particularly through language, because language is the single most complex, subtle form of communication that we have. And so what I've got to do is try and figure out what would I have to say and how to get this person to behave in the way that I want to do that thing that will alter my world for the better. And it's really subtle because people obviously don't necessarily want to spend their whole time doing things that benefit me. They've got their own agendas. So how am I going to do that? And we develop in the course of our lives these really complex understandings of how to use language and communication more generally to present ideas to people in a way that gets them to behave and respond in the way that we want. So we have to know things like, how polite should I be to this person? What are they expecting me to say? What's going to sound reasonable to them to say? But it's also things like, I walk into a situation where two languages are spoken. Which language should I use? Which one are they going to respond better to? If I speak a local variety and I think they might, should I use that variety or not? Is that going to make me sound friendly, or is it going to make me sound common? So we're making all these judgments all the time. And to do that, to be able to use these really subtle linguistic tools, we have to be able to track a lot of information, which we can refer to as the context. So we have to know, where am I? What's going on around me? Who is this person I'm interacting with? What can I pick up about them if I don't know them, to figure out how I should respond to them? What's happened before? What normally happens in this situation? And so on. So all of this contextual information will tell us how we should approach them, what our intonation should be like. Should we sound friendly? Should we sound gruff and angry? All of these things are within our power, and we do make different decisions. I'll speak differently to an annoying child next door to the way I'd speak to the Queen of England. Obviously, very different choices we make, and these are all under our command, provided that we've got a full command of what the context is.
So, learning all we know about our environment, particularly in the context of our lives, and trying to create this sort of safety and normality of what we want to keep in life, what happens then when somebody has dementia? How does that affect their communication?
The first thing to say is, of course, there are lots of different types of dementia, and so it's not easy to kind of just talk about it as a single thing, but I'll focus here on the ones that most affect communication. And there are various things that are fairly common in various types of dementia. Some relate to language itself, and some relate to memory, and some relate to information processing. So if we think about language, one of the things that we recognise as being quite indicative of some types of dementia is having difficulties finding words. So a person is halfway through a sentence and then they just can't find the word that they want. Now, we all have that problem from time to time, but it can be a real difficulty for people with some types of dementia. And that can do a couple of very straightforward things that upset the communication. One of them is that it just makes them less fluent. So they're meaning to finish a sentence and they get stuck because they can't find a word. But another thing that very often happens is that they will replace one word with another one. And sometimes it's another word that is, or a phrase that is quite useful. There was, I read somewhere about a lady who wanted to say the petrol station, and she couldn't think how to say that. And she said the place where cars go when they're thirsty. And I think that's just beautiful. It's very imaginative, quite poetic in a way. But sometimes it'll be the wrong word. So, if you say fridge when you mean washing machine, that's quite could confuse somebody quite a lot. And the other thing that will quite often happen is replacing a word with something that's more vague. So instead of naming an object, saying it or that, instead of naming a person, saying them or him or whatever, and instead of an action, you might say do that thing. And so you could get a sentence like, he did that thing when he went there. Now, the person knows what they want to say, but they haven't given the other person quite enough information for them to follow what they mean, and that can obviously cause very direct difficulties. But if we move beyond language and look at the impact on communication of problems with memory and problems with processing, this relates to what I was talking about before to do with the context. Because what you can have is a person who is trying to assess how to say something, because they want to make some little change to their world, and they're trying to assess, who am I talking to? Well, they might not be able to recall. They were introduced to this person, but they can't recall now who this person is. They may be in a strange environment and not quite be sure what it is, and therefore what's going on. Is this a doctor's surgery? Or is it, where am I? What's going on? And that makes a difference to how I will speak because of the context being different. So, and not being able to recall what's already been said as well. So that they believe that they're asking a question they haven't asked before because they don't recall anymore that they've asked it before and had an answer. And then also general processing where there's lots going on around them, and somebody without a dementia will be clocking all of that information really quickly and putting it together. Oh, that's how that person fits in there. That's what's going on over there. That's what's being referred to. And that takes a lot of very fast processing, and dementia slows the processing down. And so they may just not be able to keep up. And so you'll very often see a person living with a dementia who's in let's say a family group, and bit by bit they just kind of lose the plot of what's being said. They just can't keep up with all of this banter and all of this talking. Who's being referred to? What was that about? They've just missed it. And so what happens then is various things can happen as a result. One is, if they're trying to communicate in order to get somebody to tweak something in their world that they would like to be a little bit better, they might just gauge it wrong. And so they might say something that isn't quite suitable for the context. It's repetition when it didn't need to be, or it addresses the person in a slightly inappropriate way, or it doesn't take into account the context, what's possible in that environment. And so what then happens is, and this is what I was saying right at the beginning, where you've got to think about what happens next. So they say that thing in good faith, and then the response they get isn't the one they expected. So the person says, I've already told you that. Or, well, don't be ridiculous, we can't do that. And they're thinking, I didn't know that. How was I supposed to know that? Because they didn't have that bit of context, because they hadn't been able to keep up or they didn't recall it. And so they're now in a situation where they said something in good faith and they've got whacked back with some kind of quite negative response. Or the person is looking at them kind of vaguely and nodding and saying yes. And you think, no, that's not the response I needed. And that has actually closed down how they can now respond back, because now they're confused. What am I supposed to say? I've upset this person. I didn't mean to. I don't know what I did. So they don't know how to respond. And you can see very quickly you get into a downward spiral in the communication. And then if we think about the other side of it, when they're understanding what somebody's saying to them, now we've got somebody else who hasn't got a dementia diagnosis, who's trying to modify something in their world, and they need this person living with a dementia to do something for them. It might be tell them whether they want tea or coffee. It might be reassure them. It might be give them a bit of information. What did you have for lunch today? Or has anybody called? Or where's that letter? Or whatever it might be. So they've got something they're trying to do. The person living with the dementia, for whatever reason, either because they can't process quickly enough, or they can't decode the words, or they can't recall some of the context, doesn't reply or respond in the way that they expected. So now they're bamboozled, because you didn't do what I expected. So now then, how are they going to respond to the person living with the dementia? Why can't you just tell me that? Or what are you talking about? Nobody's called. I know that somebody called this morning. And now we've got another breakdown in communication where both people are now again feeling, whoa, what went wrong there? And over time, what's likely to happen is that both parties are going to start thinking, well, this doesn't work very well, does it, this communication? And so the unimpaired person might start thinking, do you know what? I'm not going to bother to ask those kinds of questions. I'm not going to talk about that. That's too hard. That goes wrong too often. And so they start depriving the person of the opportunity for certain kinds of interaction. It might be things like if they're offering a range of drinks, let's say in a residential care home, let's say there's 4 or 5 different drinks. You could have tea, coffee, hot chocolate, orange juice, whatever else. But that person decides, if I ask this person all these different things, they can't take it in. So it's better just to say, would you like tea or coffee? Now that seems quite sensible in a way. You just break it down to something easier. But now that poor person living with dementia is thinking, what do you have to do here to get a cup of hot chocolate? You know, I wasn't even offered that. And so the opportunities for interacting and having their world the way they would want it are being taken away from them. Now, they might respond in various ways. Some people sometimes a person living with dementia might get quite insistent. No, you didn't tell me that before. However, you might insist, but I know you didn't, because they don't recall it. And so then they start to look argumentative, belligerent, perhaps even uncooperative, and they can get labelled like that, particularly in residential care homes. She's a difficult person, she's always shouting and getting cross. But they're just trying to fight their corner, in a way, for the world as they see it, and trying to keep their world a little bit under their control, because it feels like it's getting out of their control. But another thing that can happen is they start to withdraw, because they feel, every time I ask my daughter what I think is a perfectly reasonable question, she gets cross with me. So I'd rather look after the relationship than keep having arguments with her. I don't like it when she gets annoyed with me. So I would really rather just keep quiet. So I'm just going to go with her. So when she says, would you like tea or coffee? I'm going to say, what are you having? And then the daughter, over a period of time, is going to think, she doesn't mind anymore whether she has tea or coffee. Whereas she does, but no, she's frightened to express that, in case she says, I'd love a cup of coffee, and her daughter unexpectedly says, right, I'll go and make coffee then. Why? I thought you just asked me, because they haven't picked up the context, And then the other thing that can happen is they just withdraw from the communication altogether, because they don't like that horrible feeling that they put their foot in it, got it wrong, or that however hard they try, they can't make these little changes to their world. They can't make their world the way they want it to be. And so bit by bit, they start to withdraw. People think they've got nothing to say, they don't have any needs, and they're sitting there really feeling that their world is no longer under their control. They can't make these changes because they can't use communication to do that anymore. And that's really, really sad. And the number of stories you hear about people in residential care homes particularly, who apparently sit silently, never say anything, and then when somebody does sit down with them and start interacting with them, it all comes out, and they do have needs, they do have wants, they do have preferences, but they're not daring to engage, and nobody's bothering to ask them. And so all the time we just got to be aware that beneath the surface is that set of needs. I honestly think if you imagine that a person living with a dementia is 100% satisfied with everything in their life, that they're satisfied with the way they feel, they're satisfied with their physical environment all the time, they're satisfied all the time with what they know and don't know, and everything about their life. If you think they're 100% satisfied, great, you don't need to communicate with them. But if you suspect, and why wouldn't you suspect, that like everybody else, they would love to make some little tweak to their world. They'd really like Rice Krispies today and not cornflakes, just for a change. They'd like a little bit less milk in their tea, really. But nobody is giving them the opportunity to make those changes. This is the tragic thing, and I think if we can understand more about communication, we can't fix the problems that dementia causes, but what we can do is take a step further towards opening up those opportunities for them to find ways to just modify their world to give them a little bit more of a sense of well-being.
So what can we do to help somebody who has dementia that we may be caring for or caring with, I like to always say? What can we do?
One of the key things is developing the confidence to experiment, and there are no simple answers to this. You're not going to find 3 simple rules that will do everything. It just won't. There are lots. There's advice out there about never ask questions, or only ask closed questions. Use simple language. It's not that any of those are necessarily wrong. It's just that they're as a blanket approach, that's not going to work. You've got to try something and see if it works, and see if it works today. This afternoon, it may be different tomorrow, and not kind of thinking, that didn't work last week, so there's no point trying it again. And having the confidence in yourself to think, I need to notice what's going on and find it interesting. I mean, it's really difficult in situations where you're trying to communicate to sit back and say, this is interesting. But you can do this actually away from a person living with dementia, just in ordinary interaction with other people. Notice how people do it, because we take it for granted so much. We all know how to communicate, but we don't always get it right. Things do go wrong. We do misunderstand other people. look at some of the dynamics of that. It's what we call language awareness. So it's developing the ability to spot what the opportunities are. What can one do here? What happens if I try that? What happens if I try laughing instead of getting cross, or smiling instead of frowning? What happens? And by doing that, we build up expertise. It's the biggest and most important tool in our toolbox, is our confidence to try things out. I would say also, always make the assumption that the other person communicated for a reason. Even if they are being very repetitive, saying the same thing, just literally saying the same thing over and over again, they are bothering to speak, and there's a reason for that. And even if you can't get to the bottom of what that reason is, even simply acknowledging it is honouring that person and giving them a bit of respect in realising that they took the trouble to speak. Maybe they need to hear the sound of their own voice. It could be that. It could be that they want to draw your eye gaze for a minute. It depends on the person, depends on the situation. You don't need a professor to tell you this, but honestly, it's the bottom line I've realised is, remember to be kind. Because we so easily get tied up in our own agendas, trying to change our own world, that we can forget to just respond with kindness. And actually, if they're in conflict with each other, the answer to that is, make it part of what you want to make your world good, that you're a kind person. Today I'm going to just be really kind to people. And then you will want to try and communicate in ways that enable you to achieve that. And just walking into a room, into a situation, thinking, I can be a kind person, it can just make all the difference in the world, because it gives you power, it gives you agency to be the person that you want to be. And in the course of that, you'll get more smiles out of people, you'll get more response out of people, because they feel attended to, they feel noticed, they feel that you care. And so that is something that is within our gift. It's sometimes hard to find that kindness at the end of a long day, or when it's been really, really challenging. But the bottom line is, what would be the kind thing to do here? And if it's just smiling at somebody rather than frowning, that can just make a massive difference to other people. One of the things I would really love to see happen is an increase in the number of people who would just volunteer to go in to spend time with people living with a dementia. Not necessarily do anything very much with them, just be with them, companions for them. They don't necessarily want to have huge amounts of conversation all the time. No, none of us do. But just sitting there, knitting with them, perhaps doing a jigsaw with them, or sitting watching the television with them, but somebody who's more of a companion, so that they don't feel that everybody in their environment is just rushing around all the time, ignoring them. There's somebody who's there for them. And I would just love to see it a more major part of everybody's lives, that they looked at ways that they could volunteer to do this kind of thing. Just be an extra pair of hands, pair of eyes around the place to support people living with a dementia. I think that would be fantastic.